When I pried open the lid of that stone sarcophagus and a thick fog billowed out, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient incense that made me reel, I knew I had awakened something that should have remained undisturbed forever. Inside lay a woman's body, her garments intact, a crown of dried flowers resting upon her head, untouched by time, as if buried only yesterday. But what chilled me to the bone was the realization that, at that very moment, every bell in the village began to toll spontaneously, though there was no one in the bell towers. And then I heard footsteps behind me, in the darkness of that forgotten crypt. My name is Father Michael, and for 40 years I served the church with a devotion some considered obsessive. I always believed my mission was to purify the faith of traditions I deemed outdated, of those folk customs that blended Christianity with ancient superstitions. I was a man of rigid convictions, the kind who doesn't admit of middle ground between what he considers right and wrong. And it was precisely this rigidity that led me to commit the gravest error of my life. It all began when I assumed the parish of St. Florence, a small, forgotten village nestled in the mountains. The place had a timeless quality, as if the modern world hadn't yet reached it. The houses were built of stone, the streets narrow and winding, and the residents maintained traditions practiced by their grandparents. To me, coming from the city, it all seemed like an open-air museum, full of practices that needed modernizing. In my first few days, I noticed something that deeply unsettled me. High in the mountains, isolated on a steep slope, stood an old chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The structure was in complete ruin, moss covering its ancient stone walls, broken stained glass windows no longer letting in colored light, and an altar cracked by time. But what bothered me most wasn't the state of disrepair, it was the silent devotion the villagers showed for this place. Every morning I saw small groups climbing the steep path leading to the chapel. They carried flowers, candles, small offerings. Some stayed for hours, praying softly, chanting litanies I didn't recognize in the official church manuals. It was as if the place had a life of its own, an energy I couldn't understand or control. When I questioned Mrs. Eleanor, one of the oldest residents of the village, about this devotion, she looked at me with a strange expression, a mixture of fear and reverence. "Pastor," she said in a trembling voice, "some things are best left as they are. That chapel has protected us for a long time." But I was young, arrogant, and saw in her words only ignorant superstition. To me, that ruined chapel was simply a symbol of superstitious idolatry, an obstacle to the true faith I intended to plant in those simple hearts. And so, after weeks of prayer and reflection, or at least what I believed to be reflection, I announced to the community that the chapel would be demolished. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. I saw silent tears streaming down Mrs. Eleanor's face. Mr. Thomas, the most respected man in the village, slowly shook his head and mumbled something I couldn't hear. A young mother clutched her small child to her chest, as if trying to protect him from some invisible threat. And then, one by one, the people began to rise and leave the church without a word. "Father," said Mrs. Eleanor before leaving, her voice carrying decades of wisdom I refused to acknowledge, "what sleeps beneath the ground shouldn't be awakened." At the time, I interpreted her words as another manifestation of the ignorance I intended to combat. How wrong I was. The days leading up to the demolition were marked by a heavy atmosphere in the village. People greeted me politely, but there was something different in their eyes, a mixture of sadness and apprehension that I attributed to natural resistance to change. Some tried to dissuade me, telling old stories about the chapel, but I dismissed them as baseless legends. It was Mr. Daniel, a simple man who worked at the local carpentry shop, who first told me about the woman in white. According to him, for generations there had been talk of an apparition that protected the village, a motherly figure who interceded for the residents in difficult times. "She lives in the chapel, Father," he said with tears in his eyes. "She always has, and she's always taken care of us." But I just smiled condescendingly and said those were just stories invented by the popular imagination. The day of the demolition finally arrived. The sky was laden with gray clouds, and a cold breeze descended from the mountains, carrying with it a whisper that sounded like a warning. The machines arrived early, brought from the neighboring town, and their noisy engine shattered the centuries-old silence of that sacred place. I positioned myself at a safe distance, Bible in hand, feeling completely justified in my decision. The first blows against the chapel walls echoed through the valley like distant thunder. Each falling brick seemed to tear a sigh from the mountain itself. The workers, practical men accustomed to this type of work, showed unusual hesitation. They stopped frequently, looked at each other with uneasy expressions, as if they sensed they were profaning something sacred. And then, when the altar finally came crashing down in a cascade of stones and dust, something completely unexpected happened. The ground trembled slightly, not an earthquake, but a subtle vibration, as if the earth itself were protesting. The workers stopped immediately, frightened, and that's when we realized, where there had once been the stone floor of the chapel, a dark opening had appeared, like the mouth of a tunnel forgotten by time. The air rising from that opening was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was colder than the icy mountain wind, carrying an ancient scent that mingled damp earth, incense, and something else I couldn't identify. It was as if for centuries, that air had remained trapped, guarding secrets now released to the world. Joseph, one of the most experienced workers, approached the opening with a lantern in hand. He was a courageous man, accustomed to facing difficult situations, but even he hesitated before descending. "There's a ladder down here, Father," he shouted, his voice echoing into the void. "Looks like it goes down pretty deep." And then he disappeared into the darkness. The minutes that followed seemed like an eternity. We stood there in silence, hearing only the distant echo of Joseph's footsteps and the sound of his lantern striking the stone walls. Suddenly, we heard a muffled cry, followed by hurried footsteps ascending the ladder. When Joseph emerged from the opening, his face was as pale as paper, and his eyes reflected a terror I had never seen before. "Father," he said in a trembling voice, struggling to catch his breath, "there's something down there. An ancient crypt, and there are symbols, strange symbols carved into the walls. I've never seen anything like it." His hands trembled as he spoke, and I realized that a man who had spent his life working with stone and earth was genuinely terrified by what he had seen. My first reaction was skepticism. Crypts were common in old churches, especially in mountainous regions where the rocky terrain offered natural protection for burials. But there was something in Joseph's expression that made me hesitate. This wasn't the fear of someone who simply found an old cemetery. It was the fear of someone who had witnessed something that defied their understanding. I decided to see for myself. I took a more powerful lantern and began to descend the uneven, damp steps that disappeared into the darkness. With each step, I felt the weight of silence enveloping me like a heavy cloak. The walls were of hewn stone, with a precision that revealed the work of master craftsmen from centuries past. And then I saw the symbols that had so frightened Joseph. They were complex, interwoven carvings that seemed to tell a story without words. I recognized some Christian elements, crosses, doves, angelic figures, but there were other symbols I couldn't identify, drawings that seemed to predate Christianity, coming from much older traditions. It was as if different eras and beliefs had merged in those walls, creating a visual narrative that transcended any specific doctrine. Continuing through the crypt, I reached a wider corridor where niches carved into the rock housed images and relics covered in the dust of centuries. In one of these niches, my lantern illuminated an image of the Virgin Mary, but she wasn't like the traditional representations I knew. There was something different about her countenance, a serenity bordering on the mystical, eyes that seemed to hold ancestral secrets. She stood there like a sentinel, a silent guardian of something I did not yet understand. And if you're following this account and want to continue hearing stories like this, real experiences that challenge our understanding of the world, I ask that you subscribe to the channel right now. These experiences need to be shared, because they remind us that there is far more mystery and purpose in our lives than we can imagine. You won't want to miss the next testimonies. Moving forward, I finally reached a circular chamber at the end of the corridor. In the center, like an ancestral altar, stood a stone sarcophagus, worked with a mastery that made modern sculptures seem crude. The lid was ornamented with delicate reliefs depicting scenes I couldn't fully decipher, but which conveyed a sense of solemnity and reverence. My instincts screamed at me not to touch anything, to respect that place as the sanctuary it obviously was. But pride, arrogance, the conviction that my faith was superior to any ancient tradition propelled me forward. With trembling hands, not from fear, I convinced myself, but from expectation, I began to push the lid of the sarcophagus. The stone was surprisingly heavy, as if sealed by something more than just its own weight, but with effort, I managed to move it enough to open a crack, and that's when what I will never forget for the rest of my life happened. A dense fog rose from inside the sarcophagus, as if it were the very breath of eternity escaping its temporal prison. The smell that spread through the crypt was indescribable: ancient earth, incense from centuries past, flowers that had withered long ago, and something else, something that touched my soul directly in a way that words cannot express. When the fog partially dissipated, I could see the inside of the sarcophagus. There lay the body of a woman in intact clothing, as if she had been buried yesterday. Her clothes were made of a fabric I couldn't identify, of a color that seemed to change as the lantern light moved. A crown of dried flowers adorned her head, flowers that maintained their form despite the centuries, as if time had stopped to preserve their beauty. But what most caught my attention was the silver medallion resting on her chest. It was an extraordinary piece of jewelry, with inscriptions that seemed to move under the flickering light of the lantern. They were symbols I couldn't decipher, but which conveyed a sense of antiquity and power that made me tremble. And it was at that moment, as I observed that serene and mysterious figure, that I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the walls of the crypt. My heart pounded, and for a moment, I thought it might be one of the workers who had decided to follow me. But when I turned, with the lantern trembling in my hands, I saw Mrs. Eleanor emerging from the shadows. I couldn't understand how she'd gotten there. The descent was steep and treacherous, and Mrs. Eleanor was well over 70. Yet there she was, walking with a firmness I'd never seen in her before, her eyes shining with a knowing that seemed to transcend her limited formal education. "You awakened what has protected this village for generations," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of experience. "This isn't a common tomb, Pastor. It's the seal of an ancient pact." Confused and still reeling from the discovery, I asked her to explain. Mrs. Eleanor approached the sarcophagus, and her wrinkled hands gently touched the stone edge, as if greeting an old friend. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from far away, she began to tell the legend everyone in the village knew, but no one dared repeat in front of a pastor. "Over 300 years ago," she said, "the village was ravaged by an inexplicable plague. It wasn't just a common illness, it was something that seemed to suck the very life out of the place. Healthy people died within days, with no medical explanation. The once fertile fields dried up overnight, animals mysteriously vanished, and even the river waters began to recede." Without words, she showed me images of what would happen if the situation wasn't corrected. I saw the village slowly wither, the people losing hope and vitality, the children growing up under a shadow that would never leave them. It wasn't a threat, it was simply the natural consequence of the imbalance I had created. I awoke from that encounter in tears, with a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. For the first time in my life, I understood that true faith wasn't in the rigidity of doctrines, but in the humility of recognizing that there are mysteries that transcend our limited understanding, that the sacred manifests itself in ways that our books and seminaries will never be able to fully catalog. Reconstructing the altar was the hardest part, not only because the stones were heavy and delicate, but because each fragment I put in place seemed to carry the weight of centuries of faith and devotion. My hands trembled not from exertion, but from reverence, as if I were touching something infinitely more sacred than any relic I had ever known in famous cathedrals. On the last day of the reconstruction, when I finally placed the image of the Virgin back on the restored altar, something extraordinary happened. A warm breeze, completely different from the cold wind that had dominated the region for weeks, swept across the mountain like a sigh of relief. It was as if the earth itself was breathing again, after a long period of restraint. The flowers around the chapel, which had withered and died during the dark days, suddenly bloomed in an explosion of colors and fragrances that transformed the entire landscape. Roses, daisies, lavenders, and dozens of other species that I didn't even know existed at that altitude, sprang from the ground as if it were spring in the middle of winter. The fog that had blanketed the village for weeks lifted in a matter of minutes, revealing a bright blue sky that seemed divinely washed clean. The air became pure and crystalline, charged with a vital energy that made each breath feel like a blessing. And then, like celestial music to my weary ears, I heard a child's laughter from the village, the first genuine laughter heard in weeks. In the days that followed, life gradually returned to normal. The children regained their color and vibrancy, playing in the streets with a joy that seemed even more intense after the somber period. The animals returned, from where, nobody knew, as if they had simply been waiting for the right moment to come back. The church bells once again rang only when pulled by human hands, marking the hours with their familiar and comforting music. But I was no longer the same man who had arrived in the village months before. The experience had transformed me so profoundly that sometimes I didn't recognize my own voice when I preached. Where there had been rigidity, now there was flexibility. Where there had been absolute certainties, now resided a humility that allowed me to accept mysteries without needing to explain them. I learned to see faith not as a set of inflexible rules, but as a constant dialogue between the known and the unknown, between reason and mystery. I understood that the sacred manifests itself in infinitely varied ways, and that my role as pastor was not to impose a single interpretation, but to help people find their own connection with the divine. The rebuilt chapel once again became the spiritual heart of the village, but now I participated in the traditional devotions with a completely new understanding. I saw in the faces of the faithful an ancestral wisdom that my years of seminary had never taught me. I heard in the ancient litanies echoes of truths that transcended any specific doctrine. Mrs. Eleanor became my silent teacher, teaching me through small gestures and carefully chosen words about the faith that is born from lived experience, not from studied books. She showed me how to honor both the Christian tradition and the older beliefs that had intertwined with it over the centuries. And in the sarcophagus in the crypt, which now remained sealed and respected, I knew that the guardian of the veil continued her silent vigil, not as a threat or a dark power, but as a maternal presence protecting those she had chosen to care for. Sometimes, when people went down to the crypt to leave fresh flowers or light candles, I felt a deep peace coming from that place, as if she approved of the reverence we now showed. Years passed, and my reputation spread beyond the mountains. Other pastors came to visit me, curious about the mountain pastor who had found a way to harmonize the Christian faith with local traditions. Some criticized my approach, saying that I had become overly tolerant of superstitions. Others, wiser, recognized that I had discovered something valuable about the true nature of spirituality. But for me, the opinion that mattered most was that of my parishioner, and in the glow of peace I saw in their eyes, in the confidence with which they brought their sorrows and joys to share, in the way their families flourished under a protection that I now understood and respected, I found confirmation that I had taken the right path. The transformation was not only mine, but that of the entire community. The village of St. Florence became a place where the old and the new coexisted in perfect harmony. Sunday masses included traditional church hymns, but also litanies that had been passed down from generation to generation, words that carried the wisdom of centuries. and the protection of forces that transcended our limited understanding. During religious festivals, especially in the celebration of the Virgin Mary, the entire community would ascend to the restored chapel in a solemn procession. They carried flowers, candles, simple offerings, but laden with meaning, and I walked with them, no longer as someone who judged their practices, but as someone who had learned to see the sacred in every gesture of genuine faith. Once during one of these celebrations, a young mother approached me, carrying her newborn baby. She had been trying to conceive for years without success, and the city doctors had said it would be impossible. But after spending an entire night in prayer in the chapel, before the image of the Virgin that I had almost destroyed, she conceived. "Pastor," she said with tears of gratitude, "she heard my prayer. The Lady of the Mountain heard and blessed me." I could have explained it scientifically. I could have attributed it all to coincidence or the power of suggestion. But looking at that healthy child, at the mother's radiant face of happiness, at the simple and profound faith that shone in her eyes, I understood that some things don't need to be explained, only celebrated and honored. It was then that I fully understood the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge had made me arrogant, making me believe that I could categorize and control the sacred. Wisdom taught me that mystery is an essential part of faith, that not everything needs to be understood to be respected, that some truths can only be felt with the heart. The crypt under the chapel became a place of silent pilgrimage. We didn't promote tourist visits or turn the place into an attraction, but people came, one by one, seeking a moment of connection with something greater than themselves. They descended the ancient steps with reverence, lit a candle before the sealed sarcophagus, and ascended somehow indefinably but truly transformed. I would regularly make the descent, no longer with fear or arrogance, but with gratitude. I thanked the veil keeper for her patience with my ignorance, for allowing me to learn and grow instead of simply punishing me. Sometimes, in those moments of profound silence, I felt a gentle maternal presence, like an invisible smile approving my transformation, and gradually, I realized my experience had changed, not only my pastoral approach, but my entire understanding of God. I began to see the divine, not as a distant and inflexible force, but as a living presence manifesting itself through countless forms, in nature, in ancient traditions, in the simple faith of the people, in the mysteries our minds cannot unravel. Years later, when young seminarians would come to visit to learn about evangelization in traditional communities, I always first took them to the chapel on the mountain. I showed them the place where my arrogance almost caused an irreversible tragedy, where I learned that serving God means first and foremost serving people with humility and respect. True faith, I would tell them, doesn't build walls but bridges. It doesn't destroy traditions, but purifies and elevates them. It doesn't impose truths, but invites dialogue between the human heart and the divine mystery. Some listened with skepticism, others with genuine curiosity, but they all left at least questioning their own certainties, and that was a start. Mrs. Eleanor lived to be 92, and until her last days continued to climb the steep path to the chapel. When she finally passed away peacefully in her sleep, the whole village gathered to celebrate not only her life, but her wisdom. She had been the bridge between generations, the guardian of traditions, the woman who had the courage to confront an arrogant pastor, to protect what she loved. On the day of her funeral, something extraordinary happened. As we carried her coffin along the mountain path, so she could be buried in the small cemetery next to the chapel, the flowers that had miraculously bloomed years before opened again, out of season, creating a colorful and fragrant carpet beneath our feet. It was as if the mountain itself was saying goodbye to a beloved daughter. That night, many people reported seeing two figures in white walking together through the mountains, one taller, ethereal, and the other smaller, more familiar. It wasn't a haunting or terrifying supernomenon. It was simply the image of continuity, the passing of the baton between generations of women who dedicated their lives to protecting and nurturing their community. Today, decades after that transformative experience, I still serve in the same parish. My hair has turned gray, my hands are wrinkled, but my heart remains young, nourished by the constant discovery of new facets of the sacred. The village has changed, of course. Better roads, electricity, internet have arrived, but the essence has remained untouched. The chapel on the mountain continues to be the spiritual heart of the community. New visitors arrive, drawn by the stories that have spread throughout the region. Some come out of curiosity, others out of deep spiritual need. All are welcomed with the same affectionate hospitality that characterizes the mountain people. And I have learned to see each of these encounters as an opportunity for mutual growth. I am no longer the pastor who has all the answers, but the man who has learned to ask the right questions. I don't impose my interpretation of faith, but help each person discover their own connection with the divine. The village children grew up hearing the stories of the Veil Keeper, not as horror tales, but as narratives of protection and maternal love. They play around the chapel naturally, leave drawings and wildflowers on the altar, and grow up understanding that the sacred is not something distant and threatening, but something close and welcoming. And when these children become adults and face their own crises of faith, as we all do at some point, they have a solid foundation of trust in the divine mystery. They know that not everything needs to be explained to be real, that not all blessings come wrapped in the way we expect, that true faith grows in the fertile soil of humility. Recently, a young priest from the capital came to visit me, full of the same inflexible certainties I carried decades ago. He had heard of the questionable practices I allowed in my parish, and came with the mission to correct me. I listened to his criticisms patiently, recognizing in his words echoes of my old voice. Then I invited him to spend a week in the village, participating in the daily life of the community. I asked him to accompany families in their joys and sorrows, to observe how faith manifested itself in the daily lives of simple people, to feel the peace emanating from the restored chapel. On the last day of his visit, he came to me with tears in his eyes. "Pastor," he said, "I came here thinking I was going to teach, but I was the one who learned. I have never seen faith so alive, so real, so transformative. How did you manage that?" And I smiled, remembering my own journey, and replied, "It wasn't me who managed it. They taught me. It was the ancient stones, the wisdom of the grandmothers, the mysteries that don't fit into theology books. I just learned to listen." Today, when I look back, I clearly see the connecting thread that links all the events of that transformative time. My initial arrogance wasn't simply a character flaw. It was the necessary ingredient for a lesson that needed to be learned. The Veil Keeper wasn't just a mystical figure protecting the village. She was a symbol of the sacred feminine that our patriarchal tradition had forgotten to honor. The demolition of the chapel wasn't just a pastoral blunder, it was the catalyst for a deeper understanding of how the sacred and the human intertwine. And my transformation didn't just benefit me, it radiated throughout the community, creating a model of inclusive and respectful faith that continues to inspire people to this day. I understand now that each of us carries within ourselves both the arrogant pastor and the humble man I have become. The difference lies in our willingness to question our certainties, to open our hearts to perspectives that challenge our comfort zones, to recognize that wisdom often comes from the most unexpected sources. True faith, I've learned, isn't the absence of doubt, but the courage to dance with mystery. It's not the imposition of absolute truths, but the creation of sacred spaces where different expressions of the divine can coexist and enrich one another. It's not the elimination of the old in favor of the new, but the harmonious synthesis of tradition and renewal. And so, I continue my journey, no longer as a warrior of faith, battling imaginary heresies, but as a spiritual gardener, tending the sacred ground where the seeds of transcendence can germinate and flourish. Each day brings new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities for growth and service. The chapel on the mountain remains as a silent witness to this transformation. Its ancient stones held secrets I nearly destroyed through ignorance, but which I now protect with the same devotion a mother protects her children. And down below, in the restored crypt, the veil keeper continues her eternal vigil, reminding us that some mysteries are too sacred to be profaned by human arrogance. If there's a message I'd like to leave for those who hear this testimony, it's this: keep your hearts open to mystery. Don't be afraid of traditions you don't fully understand, nor disdain the wisdom that comes from humble sources. The sacred manifests in infinitely varied ways, and our task is not to control these manifestations, but to learn to recognize and honor them. May we all find our own chapel on the mountain, our own moment of profound transformation, and may we have the courage to admit when we are wrong, the humility to ask forgiveness, and the wisdom to rebuild what our arrogance destroyed. For it is in that rebuilding, done stone by stone, with wounded hands but a purified heart, that we discover who we truly are, and what we are called to do. I was a pastor convinced of his truths. Today, I am merely a man who has learned to respect what he doesn't understand, and to believe that not all faith needs to be explained. Some only needs to be felt, lived, and honored with the reverence deserved by all sacred mysteries that make our existence infinitely richer and more meaningful.